It's really an honor to be asked to deliver a lecture as part of the Palij lecture series in Ukrainian studies. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Ezra Predolats and her colleagues at CREES for putting together this event. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming today, in person and online. As Eric mentioned, the talk that I originally agreed to give several months ago has been overtaken by the dramatic events of the last 2 weeks. That talk was focused on Ukrainian and Russian national identities and how they were articulated under Soviet rule. It developed a metaphor of a sibling rivalry, which went some way, I thought, toward explaining the intense emotions occasioned by the war that began in 2014. Sibling rivalry was certainly not meant to represent any kind of innate historical closeness or shared fate between Ukrainians and Russians, but simply to explain why emotions run so high on both sides when discussions turn to history, disinformation, and war. This approach, however, no longer seemed adequate. While emotions are still running very high, in fact, higher than ever, this war now seems to be about something else entirely. So I have rewritten it over the last 2 weeks since Russia escalated its war against Ukraine on February 24th. This is now a talk about a set of ideas about Soviet history that have interested me my entire career, but especially over the last several years since a 2016 conference at the University of Toronto on Ukrainian statehood. These have to do with the political significance of the non-Russian institutions within the Soviet Union, and especially the state structures. Today's talk, and that being said, today's talk may contain some observations that are of broader interest to the historians of the Soviet Union, and I think they're worth considering as the field responds to this war, which has upended almost everyone's assumptions. The metaphor I have chosen is that of entangled sovereignties, by which I mean two things: Russia's and Ukraine's conflicting claims to sovereignty, and the ways that the Soviet Union entangled the sovereignties of its constituent republics with its overall justifications of its own rule. In 2006, the historian James Sheehan published a piece in the American Historical Review providing an overview of what he called the problem of sovereignty in European history. He defines sovereignty as, quote, a set of claims made by those seeking or wielding power, claims about the superiority and autonomy of their authority. In his telling, the story of European history was not, as it was often told, that of the European state-building project, but about the continual definition and redefinition of sovereignty. He claimed that, quote, state-making is the ongoing process of making, unmaking, and revising sovereign claims. Sheehan's article is mostly a contextualization of the EU and ends by citing Anna Marie Slaughter's contention that European states' sovereignty has become relational rather than insular. By this, Slaughter meant that given that so many European states had delegated their power to European institutions, so the EU and its associated institutions, their sovereignty was now no longer simply about resisting external influence, but about how they chose to engage the world around them. In the hope of suggesting some new ways of thinking about the Soviet Union, I'd like to take Sheehan's discussion of sovereignty as a starting point for my talk today. A comparison of the European Union with the Soviet Union is problematic, granted, and perhaps provocative. I don't mean to take the comparison too far. Nevertheless, I hope that this talk can suggest a few new ways to understand both Soviet history and the current Russian-Ukrainian war. The talk is organized into 4 sections. First, I'm going to consider the problem of sovereignty in Soviet history. The second point of my talk will be about Russian sovereignty claims today and the problems that they pose for its relations with its neighbors. Above all, Russia defines itself as a great power and demands the sovereign right to dominate its immediate neighbors. There are a number of claims that are packed into this self-definition, and which I'll try to tease out. Third, I'd like to discuss Ukrainian sovereignty since 1991, focusing both on its most important claims as well as the way those claims are defined in tension with those of Russia. Ukraine's claims of sovereignty revolve not around a status as a great power, but around its own ability to make choices in foreign policy, even in defiance of its large neighbor. Finally, in the last section, I'm going to make a few recommendations to the field about the lessons that we should draw from this brief discussion of the problem of sovereignty in the Soviet Union. Well, that's where I'll start. The Soviet Union with its innovative and much imitated model of nationalities policy. So what was sovereignty in the Soviet Union? What was, quote, the set of claims made by those seeking or wielding power, claims about the superiority and autonomy of their authority? And for many historians, the standard answer to this question might be, the party exercises power in the name of the working class. This is probably the first and the best answer. But sovereignty is never made up of a single claim. In Sheehan's words again, it is a, quote, basket of claims. And within this basket, we might find claims about representing the working class, coexisting with claims about bringing about a world revolution, the truth claims of Marxist-Leninist ideology, the superiority of socialist economic planning, and eventually military victory over Nazi Germany and resistance to the US-led capitalist world. There were, however, other less well-known justifications of Soviet authority. And the claim that I'd like to focus on, the one most relevant to the current Russian invasion of Ukraine, is the claim that the Soviet Union had solved the nationalities problem. What was the nationalities problem? The problem was that upon the empire's collapse, the non-Russian peoples had sought to go their own way in 1917, to create their own political institutions and free themselves from national oppression under the Tsars. The USSR claimed it had solved this problem in several ways, by creating the federal structure of the Soviet Union, Republican Communist Party organizations, school systems educating children in non-Russian languages, support for cultural elites and high culture, essentially the full gamut of policies that historians have spent the last 30 years studying. These policies were expensive but nonetheless prioritized. They were, after all, designed to neuter the political appeal of nationalism across a vast multi-ethnic space that had formerly been the Russian Empire. And this remained one of the justifications of Soviet rule right up until the end in 1991. Now, ascribing any measure of sovereignty to the republics may appear chaotic when they did not exercise any measure of independence. While it is true that the CPSU or the Bolsheviks or the Politburo claimed supreme power within the Soviet Union, historians have also spent decades since the Cold War pointing out how power was diffused within the system. Local officials exercised real power in their own contexts. Cultural elites, though heavily censored, had a certain degree of discretion in how they could create national literatures or operas or music or folk cultures. And even ordinary citizens exercised some limited form of consumer choice, and authorities paid close attention to what it called popular moods. But the question of sovereignty is not quite the same as the question of power. Sovereignty is about claims, and here, of course, the Central Party reigns supreme. But did its claims not rest to a certain extent on the continued existence of the institutional structure it set up in 1922 when the Union Treaty was signed? The republics claimed some form of sovereignty in that they were supposed to represent their titular nationalities. So the Ukrainian SSR represented the people living in Ukraine, the Belarusian SSR represented the Belarusians, and on and on. The Soviet Union had created these republics, and the non-Russian peoples were supposed to be proud and grateful that they had their own states, and that they lived in harmony with the other non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. And if one pays attention to official sources outside of Moscow, it is striking the degree to which these non-Russian republics celebrated their own existence, the anniversaries of their founding, and often even their republic's leaders. And what about Russia? The Soviet Union created national republics in the empire's borderlands, but the place of the Russians within this framework was very ambiguous. They were the largest nationality, and they lived throughout the territory of the former Russian Empire. And the answer to this question is that they were given what was left over after national homelands were created for the non-Russians. The historian Yuri Slyozkin famously compared the Soviet Union to a communal apartment, with each republic having its own room, but Russia confined to the common areas. It did not really know what belonged to it and what belonged to the republics. And so when the republics closed the metaphorical doors to their apartments and put up their own flags in 1991, Russians were, it's not surprising that Russians were confused. The Russians did not have a national home or a container that they could claim for themselves, and convinced that it was its claim to the, they were convinced that their claim to the common areas were indistinguishable from claims to the entire apartment. After all, Russia had no communist party of its own, no Academy of Sciences except for the all-union Soviet Academy of Sciences, and moreover, it had to share representation with all of the myriad republics, oblasts, and okrugs that were carved into its territory by the Soviet border makers in the 1920s. This includes places that you might have heard of, like Chechnya, Tatarstan, Yakutia, Bashkortostan. So as Sheehan notes, there are gaps between the theory and practice of sovereignty. Merely having a state and exercising sovereignty are not the same thing. Soviet Ukraine, for example, had many of the institutions of a state: a parliament, a government, an Academy of Sciences, a ruling Communist Party of Ukraine, and it had its own arts and literary scenes, even a film industry, not to mention a school system. Moreover, in 1945, the Ukrainian SSR became a founding member of the United Nations, along with the Belarusian SSR and the entire Soviet Union. Note, the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic did not have its own seat. Yet the Ukrainian SSR's UN delegation voted differently from the USSR on only a single issue in the history of the 40 years of the Soviet Union's membership in that organization. So we have to go a little bit into history to understand more about this. The contemporary Ukrainian state is inseparable from Soviet state and nation-building efforts that preceded it. The Ukrainian state that emerged in 1991 was the result of a combination of Soviet state building, the ardent efforts of anti-Soviet nationalists, as well as the acquiescence of the communist elite that had grown up within the Soviet system. In 1917, just to go back into history, in 1917, following the abdication of the Tsar in what became known as the February Revolution, the first attempts to set up a Ukrainian state structure were made in the Russian Empire through the creation of the Ukrainian Central Rada. This government was organized in April 1917, and it professed a desire for federation with the Provisional Government of Russia, then in power in Petrograd. The Rada was dominated mostly by left-wing parties and represented a broad swath of Ukrainian civic organizations. Ukrainian voting behavior in elections to the Constituent Assembly a few months later in November indicated that the Ukrainian peasantry, the national movement's most important constituency, clearly preferred leftist parties that embraced national demands alongside radical land reform. And those parties, the most prominent party was the Ukrainian Socialist Revolutionaries. And indeed, these peasant demands represented the two major demands of the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917: socioeconomic fairness on the one hand, and national liberation on the other. Following the Bolshevik seizure of power in November of 1917, the Ukrainian Central Rada gradually moved away from federalism. And it moved towards the radical step of outright independence, which they eventually declared in January 1918. The Bolshevik takeover in Petrograd, of course, was followed by a long and bloody civil war, which involved the Red Army, several different white armies supporting the restoration of imperial rule, Ukrainian armed forces, Polish units, as well as anarchist formations in central Ukraine that rejected all states. The Bolsheviks only gained control over Ukraine after a long and bitter fight, in which tens of thousands of Ukrainians fought for their independence. Impressed by the strength of national identification among Ukrainians and their willingness to fight for it, and convinced nevertheless that these national feelings were a transitory phenomenon, the Bolsheviks adopted the popular slogan of national self-determination. Incidentally, US President Woodrow Wilson professed a similar ideology during the post-World War I settlement in Versailles. And then, of course, they formalized their new state in 1922 as a federation that included a Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. And if we look at the results in terms of state building of the Ukrainian Revolution, the Soviet proto-state was the longest lasting state formation that emerged as a result of the 1917 Ukrainian Revolution. It was created as a rival to the successive Ukrainian governments that had been declared in 1917, such as the Central Rada and later the Hetmanate, which was led by a Ukrainian hetman under German auspices. And in many ways, the Soviet Ukrainian state was purpose-built to channel the patriotic feelings of Ukrainians into what was to the Bolsheviks an acceptable Soviet vessel. And Soviet propaganda over the decades that followed extolled the existence of this state as one of the greatest achievements of Soviet rule, thus indirectly paying tribute to the Ukrainian people's desire to have their own state. So again, we see how the Soviet state is creating a Ukrainian state formation and modifying its claims to sovereignty to work in its own interests. In 1917, on the other hand, Russians did not pursue the goal of a Russian nation state. Russian thinkers in the 19th century had imagined that theirs was a kind of universal nation, dedicated to a special mission in world history, whether it was through a moral revival via orthodoxy or through a socialist revolution. Just like the Ukrainians, the vast majority of this Russian nation was made up of peasants. And when the Tsar abdicated and a provisional government was put in place, their major demands were related to the social questions, i.e. land privatization. They also wanted to end the war and address the creation of a fair and just economic order. Russian workers and soldiers, on the other hand, were considerably more interested in Marxist political movements, such as those represented by the two branches of the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Parties, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Far from wanting out of the Russian Empire at that time, most Russians were interested in its radical social and economic transformation. They had not experienced national oppression under the Tsars, as they were the imperial nationality, and thus the provisional government and Soviet government did not know how to respond to demands from the borderlands for national liberation. Most of the people running the provisional government and the eventual Soviet government were either Russian or from Central Russian regions. The one thing that they did seem to want, whether they were Bolsheviks or monarchists, the Russian people now, was to maintain control over the unified geography of the former Russian Empire. The White Forces slogan was "Russia one and indivisible," and the Bolsheviks reconquered almost all of the former empire's territory militarily, stopping only when they were defeated in Poland. The Ukrainian Central Rada posed a challenge to the Bolsheviks, however, and they could not simply defeat this state, and integrate it. In order to give themselves political cover, they actually created their own Ukrainian People's Republic in Kharkiv, in whose name the Red Army claimed to be fighting. And it was this republic that won the Ukrainian Civil War with the help of the Red Army. In telling this history of the Ukrainian-Soviet Revolution in subsequent decades, Soviet historians pointed out the bourgeois class nature of the Central Rada as justification for why it had to be replaced with the Soviet Ukrainian People's Republic. And these historians found the Soviet Ukrainian Republic to be on the right side of history, and the Ukrainian Central Rada, which, as I said, was dominated by peasants, but led by intellectuals, to be a kind of a bourgeois holdover from the imperial past. And in this way, the Soviet authorities claimed to respect political claims of Ukrainians, while also ensuring that the form it took would be loyal and dependent on Moscow. And across the empire, this model was followed to varying degrees. Military conquest accompanied by the creation of representative Soviet institutions for the people who were being liberated, or purportedly liberated. And because there was no national question in Russia, Russia could simply be portrayed as the homeland of the revolution, and this remained one of the key universalistic justifications for its authority. And now the Soviet Union's model for harmonizing its constituent republics' clashing sovereignty claims was, of course, quite different from that of the European Union, and the latter of which is based in law and harmonizing the legal system and taking down borders and making a single economic space. I would argue that, given this history, that the Soviet Union was rather built on coercion and the dictatorship of the party, coming as it did on the heels of war and state collapse. The violence of the revolution was a successful tool for the Soviet leadership and thus it made its way into their administrative methods. Nevertheless, it is important to emphasize that this federal structure remained in place throughout the Soviet period. It experienced distinct phases, of course, and the borders were actually frequently adjusted in response to various circumstances. And when the federal state was challenged, the state resorted to renewed coercive measures to protect its union. If we think about the sovereignty claims made by the rulers of the Soviet Union, we see that there's more to their appeals to non-Russians than simply the creation of representative institutions and non-Russian high culture. The Soviet Union attempted to extend its control over non-Russian parts of the old empire through a combination of carrots and sticks, the positive promotion of nationalities policy, as well as the mailed fist of repression that it was willing to visit upon that policy's critics. So where does that leave us when we think about Russia's aspirations and its claims to sovereignty after 1991? The largely unresolved and overlooked status of Russians created complications once the Soviet Union began to collapse. Yes, a Russian nationalist movement had developed in the USSR in the 60s and 70s, and it was concerned about the erasure of traditional values, that sort of Soviet economic modernization had changed social structures, and so it wanted to return Russian people to traditional values as opposed to Soviet values. And this nationalist movement was largely tolerated under Brezhnev, which distinguished it from the way that the regime treated non-Russian nationalist movements, which were zealously prosecuted. And this Russian national question, the biggest of all, did not really find a public hearing and didn't make it onto the political agenda until well into the late 1980s. It emerged in full force in tandem with Boris Yeltsin's skillful handling of it during his rise to power within the Russian Republic. Given this, Russia's embrace of independence took place under drastically different circumstances from the other republics. The Soviet Union's numerically dominant nationality took its geographically overwhelming large territory and simply left the Union. And without Russia, what would be left? A few small republics, maybe in Central Asia, maybe in the Caucasus. But the Russians really dealt the decisive blow to the collapsing Soviet Union. Yet, the desire of Russians to leave the Soviet Union is often forgotten or glossed over in public accounts of the collapse of communism, as if their resentment and post-imperial phantom limb syndrome were preordained. At the same time, however, many Russians in 1991 genuinely sought to create a national home for themselves and take their place within the international system as Russia, rather than as a global superpower. Moreover, many Russians were excited about their first chance at democracy since 1917. The Russian Federation may not have quite fit the bill as a national homeland because it included non-Russian territories such as Tatarstan, Chechnya, or Yakutia, but maybe it would be good enough. Many hoped that Russia could remain satisfied with these borders and live in peace with its new neighbors. Now, history did not take this path, of course, but the point is this was one plausible scenario among many. And the point of emphasizing it is not simply to say, well, it all could have gone a different way, but to complicate our understanding of Russia's inheritance from the Soviet Union and to pose a few questions. For example, would the new Russian Federation inherit the Soviet Union's status as a permanent member of the UN Security Council? Would it assume the Soviet Union's foreign debts? The answer to these questions was, of course, yes. But more relevant for our purposes is the question of how Russia would redefine the Soviet Union's sovereignty claims. Gone were the claims to leadership of the world revolution, Marxist-Leninist historical inevitability. There wasn't even a Cold War to be fought anymore. And what gave Boris Yeltsin and the new Russian government legitimacy? Perhaps it would be democracy, freedom, and peace. But the 1990s made an adequate answer to this question very difficult for the new Russian state to provide. Multiple economic collapses, the looting of state resources, and multiple wars in Chechnya proved to be too pressing. The problem of sovereignty remained ill-defined in Russia in the 1990s. And unfortunately, there isn't enough time for a more detailed discussion here, though, so I'm going to skip ahead to Putin's vision. And really, the 1990s remained a kind of strange intermediary period between what we know as the Soviet period and what we now know as the Putin era. So, what is Putin's vision? On a panel over the weekend, I was struck by a speaker who noted that Vladimir Putin believed that only great powers exercise true sovereignty in the international system. And it shouldn't have taken me by surprise, because it seems obvious that Putin could not care less about the sovereignty of his neighbors. Given the recent treatment of German and French diplomatic outreach, it would also seem that he does not consider their sovereignty very important either. Only the US and China seem to weigh in his decision-making. And since the United States has ruled out a direct military intervention and China has maintained neutrality, Putin's forces have continued to attack Ukraine. Russia clearly does not feel constrained by Ukraine's claims to sovereignty. All of which leads up to my first point. As I've said, Russia bases its sovereignty on its aspirations to be a great power. Putin clearly regards the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of its superpower status as something to be regretted, or as a source of humiliation. Much of Russia's unhappiness with the international order is that its concerns and policies are not taken into account by other world powers. Russia defines itself as a great power, and the states surrounding it in its near abroad are small states that should naturally fall under Russian influence. And the second big kind of plank of Russia's sovereignty claims is that it claims to protect Russian speakers from the oppression that they might face abroad. And obviously this applies most concretely to Russian speakers in Ukraine and to a certain extent other countries in the region, particularly Kazakhstan. This is irrespective of whether these Russian speakers are actually oppressed, whether the Russian language is being discriminated against in public life. But this is a central kind of a theme that Putin returns to again and again. Of course, there are clear limits, right? So what about Alaska? That's historically Russian territory. What about Brooklyn? Lots of Russian speakers in Brooklyn. And maybe even Berlin. Lots of Russian speakers in Berlin. But Putin's claim to protect Russian speakers really only is relevant in the former Soviet countries that surround Russia. Paradoxically, though, as Timothy Snyder has noted, it does not seem to include Russian speakers within the Russian Federation, whose rights are severely restricted. So I think it's important, while we acknowledge Putin's policy of protecting the Russian speakers, using Russian state power to protect them, I think it's important to problematize this as well. The third big point is Russian nationhood. So who belongs to the Russian nation? Clearly, the citizens of the Russian Federation qualify, no matter what their ethnic background. These are citizens of the state. He's willing to send people from Bashkortostan or any part of Russia to fight his wars. But then, among his neighbors, the neighboring countries, who else belongs to the Russian nation? And Putin told us that out of those neighbors, he clearly thinks of Belarusians and Ukrainians differently. And in this, he's returning to the idea of a tripartite Russian nation, which was sort of developed most prominently in the 19th century, in which the Russian nation as a whole is made up of the Great Russians, the Little Russians, i.e. Ukrainians, and White Russians, i.e. the Belarusians. So this is another aspect of his definition of Russian sovereignty. He sees the Russian nation and the Russian state as not lining up neatly. And lastly, there's a question about where is it legitimate for Russia to use military force while abroad? The Soviet Union claimed the right, for example, to support revolutionary movements wherever they could be found in the Third World or in the Second World or the First World, wherever there were socialists, the Soviet Union had an interest, right? And today, Russia limits its claims to be able to intervene militarily to the near abroad and to prop up client states when circumstances allow, such as what happened in Syria. Obviously, the other legitimate place for the use of force is to apply it to Russian dissidents and to punish opposition political leaders and discipline oligarchs that step out of line. So that's just kind of an overview of the big planks of the big claims that Russia makes that define what Putin sees as his country's sovereignty. But yet the question of the gap between the theory and the practice of Russian sovereignty remains an open one. Just how much capacity does the Russian state have to enforce Putin's vision? Russia's military has never attempted to inflict a battlefield defeat on a country the size of Ukraine. And does the country have the soft power capacity to match its hard power capacity? After this war, the answer will likely be no. Does it indeed have enough hard power capability to enforce any of its claims, particularly in regard to Ukraine? All of these questions remain open. And what remains, however, is that Russian sovereignty claims are focused on its own status as a great power that influences its neighbors, and that's why it rejects their demonstrations of sovereignty with such vehemence. Its claims to sovereignty remained entangled with the claims of its neighbors, in much the same way that Russia's sovereignty before '91 was entirely entangled with that of the Soviet Union. Now I'll turn to Ukraine since '91. In a long essay in Daedalus, the Harvard historian Roman Shpurlyuk argued that the, quote, idea of Ukraine as a nation was that its people should have direct access to the centers of civilization rather than being condemned to inferior status, that they should be communicating with the world at large on their own rather than through intermediaries. And he meant this in the context of an imperial-dominated European order in which Ukrainians had to either look to Vienna as a political capital, to Krakow as a political capital, or to Moscow and Petersburg as a political capital. And his rendering of the national idea of Ukraine dovetails nicely with my own takes on Ukrainian sovereignty, namely that its sine qua non since 1991 is that it should be free to make its own choices in foreign policy. And this claim, of course, is inherently entangled with Russia, and it is in fact in opposition to these Russian claims, and it will remain that way for as long as the Russian state defines its sovereignty in terms of being a great power. Ukraine's ability to define its foreign policy is at the heart of its claims to sovereignty, and events have borne that out. The eruption of the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine's Revolution of Dignity began in 2013 when former President Viktor Yanukovych backed away from a free trade agreement with the EU. This capitulation to Russian pressure, in fact, caused his downfall directly. Ukrainians wanted to engage the world on their own terms. And today, the most dramatic demonstrations of Ukrainian sovereignty are President Volodymyr Zelensky's frequent calls with world leaders, his invitations to address parliaments, his rejection of exile, his willingness to fight and to engage allied countries and countries to his west. Another major aspect of Ukrainian sovereignty claims is related to the country's indivisibility, which suggests that a partition into Western and Eastern Ukraine is not an acceptable outcome to the war, and it won't be acceptable to any Ukrainians. A frequently heard chant at Ukrainian rallies over the last couple of decades is Одна єдина соборна Україна, which means approximately one single, united, universal Ukraine. The word soborna is a little bit difficult to translate, but you might render it using the word Catholic with a small c. So one that takes into account all the different ways of being Ukrainian. One might be tempted to say that this demand is hardwired into the Ukrainian national movement. So partition, again, is not going to be an option. If you just look back to the Ukrainian Revolution of 1917, the Western Ukrainian People's Republic, which was declared in what had been the Austrian Empire, chose, instead of holding on to its own independence in conflict with Poland, it chose instead to declare an active union with the Ukrainian People's Republic centered in Kiev in January 1919. As Shpurlyuk notes, Western Ukrainian activists had never seen themselves in isolation from their Eastern Ukrainian counterparts and could only imagine a national existence in union with them. Later, Stalin's fateful choice to integrate Western Ukraine into the Ukrainian SSR in 1939, and to somewhat lesser extent Khrushchev's transfer of Crimea in 1954, was a paradoxical Soviet enactment of Ukrainian national goals and demonstrates the enduring importance placed upon the Ukrainian question by the Soviet leadership. In this sense, the Ukrainian SSR was a technology of Soviet rule, but it was also the most prominent example of how important the claim of having solved the nationalities problem was to the Soviet project's sovereignty claims. And while there have been and again, I'm just going to say one more thing about Ukrainian sovereignty. So while there have been historically numerous claims of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territories that have extended beyond the 1991 borders of the country, for example, the Polish city of Przemyśl, some areas near Kursk and Belgorod to the north of Ukraine, and most prominently the Ukrainian-speaking or formerly Ukrainian-speaking areas of the Kuban in Russia's North Caucasus. These potential territorial claims have been completely ignored by the Ukrainian state since 1991. Ukrainians largely accepted the borders of their country that they inherited from the Soviet Union. True, they may not have been in a position to make any revisionist claims, but the complete absence of these claims from Ukraine's political discourse should underscore the fact that Ukrainian sovereignty does not contain irredentist or revisionist claims on the territory of other countries. So how are Ukrainian and Russian sovereignty claims related to one another today? In the way that I have formulated them here, they're irreconcilable. Ukraine is simply too important to Russia's definition of itself as a great power for it to refrain from interfering in Ukraine's foreign policy and internal affairs. Ukraine, for its part, can only pursue an independent foreign policy for itself in opposition to Russia. For it can only access the outside world's political institutions, economy, and culture directly, rather than having them be mediated by Russia. So what does the future hold for Ukraine? Much depends, of course, on subsequent developments in this war. So we've outlined how the Soviet Union attempted to harmonize the national aspirations of its constituent peoples through its federal structure and claims to have resolved the national question, as well as having granted statehood to the Ukrainian people. But I think it's important to remember that this arrangement was backed up by force, through both the force of arms during the Civil War and through the willingness of the state to unleash mass repression on its own population. And this makes it, of course, a very different arrangement from the European Union. And by no means a small state, Ukraine nevertheless subscribes to the more commonly accepted definitions of sovereignty inscribed into the UN Charter: territorial integrity, independence, unity. So, with those overviews, given whither the field, I'd like to touch on some implications for our field of the war and the model of entangled sovereignties that I've outlined above. First, and perhaps most obviously, we need to continue to listen to non-Russian voices in our historical scholarship and in our public commentaries on the war. The Soviet Union was never simply a continuation of the Russian Empire, but rather it became a supranational state arrangement meant to resolve major dilemmas of sovereignty introduced by the Russian Empire's collapse. Conflating the Soviet Union with Russia strips non-Russians of their historical agency and promotes historical illiteracy about the region that we study. Listening and writing about non-Russian voices challenges Russocentric assumptions that persist in the field, and especially in our public culture. Second, we need to continue to problematize the successful integration of non-Russian territories into the Soviet Union. In other words, the appropriation and alteration of their sovereign claims by the Soviet state. This process was only superficially similar to the voluntary modification of sovereignty undertaken by European countries after World War II. If European countries modified their sovereignty to make it relational rather than simply insular, they are correctly seen as having chosen this path for their own reasons of self-interest. The entangled sovereignties at the heart of the Soviet federal structure were rather different. It was not acceptable for Soviet Russia to enter into federal relations with non-Russian republics, such as the Ukrainian People's Republic. Rather, these competing states had to be destroyed, and new Soviet republics had to be declared to replace them. Only could these Soviet republics enter into a union structure with Soviet Russia. This was the Soviet states' grotesque tribute to Ukrainian sovereignty, and it was a far cry from the gift from Lenin to the Ukrainian people, as it would later be portrayed by the Russian leader. Third, we need to continue to invest in area studies and value the insights that specialists focused on a single geography can offer us. And I know that I'm preaching to the choir here, but I want to make this point nevertheless. Learning Ukrainian or Kazakh should not be seen as a niche project, but rather as a necessary supplement to a thorough knowledge of Russian if one wants to study Eurasia. We also need to alter how we train specialists. When I applied to graduate school, there was a requirement for those wanting to study Russian and Soviet history to know Russian, as well as French or German. Now, it is good to know French or German, but isn't it just as important to know one or more non-Russian regional language? Area studies such as CREES can continue to point out to academic departments the value of studying non-Russian languages and cultures. And lastly, I want to stress that we may be witnessing a real historical turning point. The resolution of the Russian-Ukrainian war will determine many things that we will later come to regard as natural. It is essential to both keep up with the constant flow of news and at the same time to continue to think about the significance of these events for our own understanding of the world and Eurasia in particular. This talk, as incomplete and insufficient as it might be, is an effort to analyze these events in real time. And as such, I'm happy to take your questions.
We have about 15 minutes or so for questions, and also questions from our live stream audience.
Great. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for insights and comments. You know, I'm always puzzled by this sort of great power definition that says I'm a great power, or I'm not one. If I don't, my views aren't taken into account. So it's the phrase "not taken into account," which is part of the reference here. And I'm always trying to imagine with Russia at what point in engaging them, and taking them into account, but then coming up with we took you into account, but we rejected what you're saying, but we took you into account. Would that be acceptable? You know what I'm saying? I mean, it seems like it's not just taking, defining their great power as having all their considerations taken into account, but it's in fact, taking their, doing what they want. Is that true, or am I missing something?
Yeah, no,
Russia decides.
I agree. I mean, that's the way that it's often phrased, and
I mean, the Russians phrase it that way too. But they don't really
yeah.
mean it. Is my point. Is that true, or am I missing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that indicates that this is a kind of framed as a grievance rather than as a policy demand that can be negotiated and accommodated. I don't know whether that's made for domestic consumption or what, but it is very hard to negotiate with that kind of a position. And maybe, the situation with NATO, it should be stressed, at the end of the 1990s was very unclear as well. There was real interest in engaging Russia. There was real interest on the Russian part to deepen cooperation with NATO. I'm not a NATO specialist, but I think that things could have looked a lot different, and perhaps some of that fault is Western countries not taking into account the possible consequences on Russian public opinion and policies, and not providing adequate assurances. But I also think that when you have a grievance, you're just gonna keep going back to it and pointing to it again, and it's really hard to know what is enough. And thank you for your question.
Thank you again for the talk. I listened to some of President Putin's history lesson a couple weeks ago regarding the origins of Ukraine. My question is, what percentage of the Russian population buys into that? I mean, is that how they look at where Ukraine came from? Or that basically a gift from Mother Russia?
I mean, it's really hard to know for sure what the Russians think about these kinds of historical historical explanations, right, of Ukraine's origins, of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia. But one thing I can say is that public understandings of Ukraine and Russia are woefully underinformed by expert analysis within Russia of Ukraine. The Ukrainian studies infrastructure in Russia is sorely underdeveloped, right? So they don't have necessarily sources of good information from reputable authorities apart from what they see on television. And I think that's indicative of the seriousness with which Russia takes Ukraine. It doesn't invest in a Ukrainian studies infrastructure. It closes down Ukrainian cultural institutions in Russia. It's very happy to hang on to these kinds of mythological historical narratives and defend them from dissenters.
Do you think it was indicative at all that the Kremlin appointed this Vladimir Medinsky to serve as the chief negotiator Medinsky, as far as I know, what little I've read is he probably wrote the history that President Putin gave, a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, well, exactly. I mean, the important thing is that Russian explanations of Ukrainian history are not interested in, a real representation of historical events. They're used in a kind of instrumental way to justify the policies that the Russian government pursues against Ukraine. And it's very sad because it's very hard to see a way out of this.
Yeah.
Yep.
Monica Eppinger on Zoom asks, thank you for this talk and for sharing your expertise. This is a really interesting and helpful distinction. European Union's relational sovereignties and the Soviet Union's entangled sovereignties. If the circumstances of its birth, violent collapse of the preceding government, shaped Soviet governance and its sovereignty claims, what is the present giving birth to, and how will the circumstances of this birth shape governance and sovereignty claims to come?
Oh, of course, Monica Eppinger asks a really big question, but thank you for that. I think it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what this is going to usher in. I mean, one plausible scenario is that Russia destroys Ukrainian sovereignty, partitions Ukraine, and the world returns to a kind of great power competition such as it existed prior to the First World War. Except this time the great powers also have nuclear weapons. That's a much more unpredictable world. That's a dangerous world. That's not a rules-based international order. That seems to be the kind of multipolar world that Putin has repeatedly claimed that he wants to return to. And obviously that's not a stable world. That's a world of competition and the domination of small countries by large countries. So that's one plausible scenario that we could be facing. And things could also go a different way. And Russia could suffer a defeat in Ukraine. And in that case, it's plausible to imagine a governance crisis in Russia in which a new government comes to power that promises to fix the mistakes that had been made by the previous administration. And that could plausibly lead to a different kind of scenario. It's very hard to tell.
Thank you. Very thought-provoking talk. I particularly appreciate how you, by thinking historically and drawing attention to the development of narrative or discourses of sovereignty over the longer period, help us to understand the contemporary issues. In current coverage, news media really succumbs to the traditional great man explanation of history and says a lot about Putin. And I noticed you avoided that a lot. You were talking a lot about Russia or Ukraine's visions of sovereignty. You use the pronoun it quite often in referring to what each state thinks. But at a certain point, I think I want to push back just a little bit to say that, to what extent do states have ideologies or agencies, and to what extent do we need to be looking at the officials or the agents, the people who are saying or stating these things or articulating them? And maybe do we need to get right back to Putin? Despite how useful this perspective is, who's doing the identifying, who's doing the defining, who's creating these discourses? Because nationalism, as I understand it, is situational. It means it can change quickly. Yeah. But some people have outsized influence in how those discourses change. So I just would love to hear you reflect a little bit on the agents, the people who are making these claims.
Yeah, of course. I take your point that sometimes these things depend on leadership, sometimes they depend on how states define their interests. leadership does matter to a great degree, and leaders set the priorities for their states. You can just take the example of Zelensky in Ukraine, who has rallied the Ukrainian public like no other politician, has rallied international support for Ukraine in a way that would be completely inconceivable by his predecessors. And he also was elected with 73% of the vote in the last election. So you can see how leadership really does matter. And again, like I mentioned this, I alluded to this a little bit, but things seem like they could have evolved in a different way in the 1990s, before Putin ascended in the Kremlin. So it's very possible to imagine a different kind of definition of sovereignty for Russia. That being said, I mean, Russia is a very large country. Russia has nuclear weapons. Russia is quite powerful in comparison to its neighbors. And so it is going to have some interests, right, as a state in what its neighbors do. But perhaps it can find a better modus vivendi with those states, especially if Ukraine joins the European Union and suddenly Russia has a large Russian-speaking neighboring country with which it can do business. Could be an entryway into the EU. You know, that's another plausible, positive kind of take on Russian and Ukrainian entanglements. But for that to be the case, I mean, it really requires a change in leadership, I think, at this point. Yeah.
Yaroslav asks, why do you use the term civil war for events in Ukraine of 1917 to 1921? It was the same military invention as we experience now.
Well, I mean, I think, yeah, it's important to be careful in your terminology. I think what I meant, the period is most often referred to as the Ukrainian Revolution, right? As a kind of a time of Ukrainian national liberation attempts, as a time when multiple different states claiming to speak for the Ukrainian people succeeded one another, and they fought all comers to preserve Ukrainian statehood. I do think there are aspects of a civil war at that time within Ukraine, and often revolutions do result in civil wars. I don't think it's controversial to talk about the Russian Revolution, also talking about the Russian Civil War. So I think in those terms, you know, Ukrainians fought in multiple different armed formations and often against one another at the same time. So I think that you can talk about a civil war at that time as well. It's more problematic, but it's also plausible to talk about a Ukrainian civil war in the Second World War, when there were Ukrainians serving in armed formations in the Polish army and the nationalist forces in the Red Army, you know. So it's not always talked about super carefully, but I don't think there's anything controversial in talking about in the First World War context. Yeah.
I had a question about the sort of legacy of the Soviet multi-ethnicity and contemporary Russia and Ukraine as multi-ethnic societies. I was just wondering if you could maybe contrast the two, because it strikes me, I mean, you know, both are obviously multi-ethnic, and you know, Ukraine has Tatar and Greek and populations, and also they're long-standing, and also many people that moved around during the Soviet period to Ukraine. You know, Russia too, as you mentioned, has all these autonomous regions. Most of them are not very autonomous, but some are, you know, like Chechnya under Kadyrov is actually quite autonomous. I mean, and in a way, it's almost shocking, and I think potentially could undermine or sort of made Putin reliant on him more than the other way around. Ukraine, I mean, there seems to be some, you see the legacies, I would say, of Soviet multi-ethnicity, but also sort of maybe a more coherent pan-Ukrainian identity that includes, you know, two languages at least, and sort of a range of people. And I'm wondering, you know, if you sort of see some post-Soviet or non-Soviet multi-ethnicity more in Ukraine than in Russia.
I think that the thing about Russia is that it's still a federation, right? That's the biggest difference, I think. The Russian Federation is made up of something like 90 different subject entities, and there is kind of this federal structure that's preserved. And of course, obviously, all these countries are multi-ethnic, and they have populations made up of all kinds of different ethnic and racial groups and religious groups. I mean, they're just very diverse, and they're also like large receiving countries for immigration at the same time, right? So they're different, but the way that I think the state is structured in Russia still attaches a kind of significance, a political significance to ethnic identity, because it has these constituent republics. And in Ukraine, it's less the case. The only situation in Ukraine, the only ethnic sort of sub-state unit in Ukraine after '91 was Crimea, and Crimea was originally an oblast, so it was just the same as all the other oblasti, but then it became an autonomous republic, right? And it was actually given quite a lot of autonomy, and there was fears that Crimea would go its own way in the early '90s, but the Ukrainian authorities seem to have come to a way of a negotiated agreement, right, with the Crimean political leadership. So the rest of Ukraine doesn't really have a history of kind of ethnic, these like sub-state units in the same way. So when Putin took Crimea, it's sort of it's different in kind than when he fomented this rebellion in the Donbass, because the Donbass had never had a kind of independent existence, even under Soviet rule, right? There wasn't really like an ethnic criterion that was used to draw those borders. So it was just part of Ukraine, which is why I think he found a lot more difficulty there than in Crimea. So there's some kind of an it seems to me a difference in how they organize their state structures and their institutions. And of course, we could talk more in detail about what that means for people who live in those countries as well.
I think the point with territorialization is really key.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. You brought up Kazakhstan earlier, and speaking of entangled sovereignties, I'm wondering how much of you see, how much of your talk you see is applying to Kazakhstan, and where you see the differences.
With Kazakhstan or Tatarstan? Kazakhstan. Yeah. It's a great question. I think we don't talk about this enough as a field, just how many sort of structural things there are in common between Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Obviously, there's a regional sort of gradation in Kazakhstan between the north and the south. The north has a larger Russian population than the south of Kazakhstan. And I think that many Kazakhs do feel sort of struck by how similar their situation might be with the Ukrainian situation. And I spent time in Almaty, and I've been in Kazakhstan, and many times when I went there in 2014, I'd have a conversation with people, and they would tell me, "Why do you have so many nationalists in Ukraine? It's terrible there. You have all these problems." In Kazakhstan, we love one another. We get along. We have a kind of tradition of multicultural tolerance in Kazakhstan, and obviously that's a story that the Kazakh state has told about itself since '91. That Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic, tolerant place. But among people who really are observers of international politics, I think many of them see the kind of similar structural situation that they're in to Ukraine. Does that sort of answer your question? So I haven't done as much research in Kazakhstan, but I do have some familiarity with it. I do think there should be a lot more research on just kind of commonalities and similar historical experiences.
And the last question from the live stream.
David Menninger asks, did the trajectory of Ukrainian national identity change much in the first decade after the dissolution of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I think it did. I think the Ukraine that emerged after '91 was significantly weaker as a state, had a lot more kind of holdovers in terms of politics, with a large representation of communists in the parliament, and it really wasn't able to move decisively in a kind of direction of reform because there was too much going on in the economy with hyperinflation and the loss of export markets and all kinds of difficulties. And so I think the Ukrainian state was faced with a similar kind of dilemma about what constituted its own sovereignty than as the Russian state experienced in the 90s. And I think that how would I say this? I mean, I think that there was a lot more sort of hope and optimism about the relationship with the Russian Federation in the early 90s, about how Russia and Ukraine could go towards democracy together, about how they could maintain cooperation, maintain the important ties that had connected them previously. I think that was a pretty strong factor in Ukrainian politics in the 90s. And then, since the reforms that were put in place at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, Ukraine has really gone on its own path and gone in its own direction. So I think that that is an option that was open at the time, but it's closed at this point now. After 8 years of war with Russia, there's very, very little hope in Ukrainian society for Russia to be any different, and that's one of the long-term, I think, tragedies of this war. That these two countries will be forever, or at least for decades, right? Engulfed in this kind of bitterness that's going to result from this war.
All right, please join me in thanking